Chapter 20, continued. Exhausted and bleeding, Ansett lay on the floor, his right arm covered with blood. The pain reached him now, and he groaned, though his song was as much a song of triumph as of pain. Somehow Ansett had had strength enough, had withstood it long enough that he had not killed Father McCall. Finally he rolled over and sat up, nursing his arm. The bleeding had settled to a slow trickle. McCall was still sitting in the chair, which had healed itself. The Chamberlain stood where he had stood 10 seconds before, at the beginning of Ansett's ordeal, the goblet looking ridiculous in his hand. Richter's laser was aimed at the Chamberlain. "Call the guards, Captain," McCall said. "I already have," Richter's answered. The button on his belt was glowing. Guards came quickly into the room. "Take the Chamberlain to a cell," Richter's ordered them. "If any harm comes to him, all of you will die, and your families too. Do you understand?" The guards understood. They were Richter's men, not the Chamberlain's. There was no love there. Ansett held his arm. McCall and Richter's Ashen waited while a doctor came and treated it. The pain subsided. The doctor left. Richter's spoke first. "Of course you knew it was the Chamberlain, my lord." McCall smiled faintly. "That was why you let him persuade you to call Ansett back here, to let him show his hand." McCall's smile grew broader. "But my lord, only you could have known that the songbird would be strong enough to resist a compulsion that was 5 months in the making." McCall laughed, and this time Ansett heard real mirth in the laughter. "Richter's Ashen," McCall said. "Will they call you Richter's the Great, or Richter's the Usurper?" It took Richter's a moment to realize what had been said. Only a moment. But before his hand could reach his laser, which was back in his belt, McCall's hand held the laser that was pointed at Richter's heart. "Ansett, my son, will you take the captain's laser from him?" Ansett got up and took the captain's laser from him. He could hear the song of triumph in McCall's voice. But Ansett did not understand. What had Richter's done? This was the man that Este had told him was as much like McCall as any man alive. And McCall had conquered the galaxy. Oh, Este had warned him, and he had taken only reassurance from it. "Only one mistake, Richter's Ashen," McCall said. "Otherwise brilliantly done. And I really don't see how you could have avoided that mistake either." "You mean Ansett's strength?" Richter's asked, his voice still trying to be calm, and succeeding amazingly well. "Not even I counted on that. I was prepared to kill him if I needed to." The words did not hurt Ansett. He would rather have died than hurt McCall, and he knew that McCall knew that. "Then I made no mistakes," Richter said. "How did you know?" "Because my Chamberlain, unless he were under some sort of compulsion, would never have had the courage to argue with me, to insist on taking Ansett on his stupid military expedition, to dare to suggest your name when I asked him who ought to become the new captain of the guard. But you had to have him suggest you, didn't you? Because unless you were captain, you wouldn't have been in a position to take control when I was dead. The Chamberlain would be the obvious guilty one, while you would be the hero who stepped in and held the Empire together. The best possible start to your reign. No taint of assassination would have touched you. Of course, half the Empire would have rebelled immediately. But you're a good tactician, and a better strategist, and you're popular with the fleet and a lot of citizens. I'd have given you 1 chance in 4 of making it, and that's better odds than any other man in the Empire." "I gave myself even odds," Richter said, but now Ansett could clearly hear the fear singing through the back of his brave words. Well, why not? Death was certain now, and Ansett knew of no one, except perhaps an old man like McCall, who could look at death, especially death that also meant failure, without some fear. But McCall did not push the button on the laser, nor did he summon the guards. "Kill me now and finish it," Richter said, pleading for an honorable death, though he knew he did not deserve it. McCall tossed the laser away. "With this, it has no charge. The Chamberlain installed a charge detector at every door to my chambers over 15 years ago. He would have known if I was armed." Immediately, Richter's took a step forward, the beginning of a rush toward the Emperor. Just as quickly, Ansett was on his feet, despite the bandaged arm, ready to kill with the other hand, with his feet, with his teeth. Richter's stopped cold. "Ah," McCall said. "You never had time to learn from the man who taught Ansett. What a bodyguard you gave me, Richter's." Ansett hardly heard him. All he heard was McCall's voice saying, "It has no charge." McCall had trusted him. McCall had staked his life on Ansett's ability to resist the compulsion. Ansett wanted to weep in gratitude for such trust, in fear at such terrible danger only barely averted. Instead he stood still, with iron control, and watched Richter's for any sign of movement.
Richter's, McCall went on, your mistakes were very slight. I hope you've learned from them, so that when an assassin as bright as you are tries to take your life, you'll know all the enemies you have, and all the allies you can call on, and exactly what you can expect from each.
Ansett looked at Richter's face, and remembered how glad he had been when the tall soldier had been made captain. "Let me kill him now," Ansett said.
McCall sighed.
"Don't kill for pleasure, my son. If you ever kill for pleasure, you'll come to hate yourself. Besides, weren't you listening? I'm going to adopt Richter's Ashen as my heir."
"I don't believe you,"
Richter said, but Ansett heard hope in his voice.
"I'll call in my sons. They stay around court, hoping to be closest to the palace when I die," McCall said. "I'll make them sign an oath to respect you as my heir. Of course they'll sign it, and of course they'll all break it, and of course you'll have them all killed the first moment you can after you take the throne. If any of them is smart at all, he'll be at the other end of the galaxy by then. But I doubt there'll be any that bright. When shall we have you crowned? 3 weeks from tomorrow is enough time to wait. I'll abdicate in your favor, sign all the papers. It'll make the headlines on the newspapers for days. I can just see all the potential rebels tearing their hair with rage. It's a pleasant picture to retire on."
Ansett didn't understand. "Why? He tried to kill you."
McCall only laughed. It was Richter's who answered. "He thinks I can hold his empire together, but I want to know the price." "Price? What could you give me, Richter's, that you wouldn't take as a gift for yourself anyway? I've waited for you for 60 years, 70 years, Richter's. I kept thinking, surely there's someone out there who covets my power and has guts and brains enough to come and get it. And at last you came. You'll see to it that I didn't build for nothing, that the wind won't tear away everything the moment I'm not there to hold it up. All I want after you take the throne is a house for myself and my songbird until I die. On Earth, so you can keep an eye on me, of course. And with a different name, so that I won't be plagued by all the bastards who will try to get my help to throw you out. And when I'm dead, send Ansett home. Simple enough?" "I agree," Richter said. "How prudent." And McCall laughed again.
Chapter 21. The vows were made. The abdication and the coronation took place with a great deal of pomp, and Susquehanna's caterers and hotel keepers became wealthier than they ever dreamed of. All the contenders and pretenders were slaughtered, and Richter spent a year going from system to system to quell all the rebellions with his own mixture of brutality and sympathy. After the first few planets were at peace, the populace happy and the rebels butchered, most of the other rebellions quelled themselves. It was only the day after the papers announced that Richter's Ashen was coming home when the soldiers appeared at the door of the little house in Brazil where McCall and Ansett lived. "How can he?" Ansett cried out in anguish when he saw the soldiers outside. "He gave his word!" "Open the door for them, my son," McCall said. "They're here to kill you!" "A year was more than I hoped for. I've had that year. Did you really expect Richter's to keep his word? There isn't room in the galaxy for two heads that know the feel of the imperial crown." "I can kill most of them before they could come near. If you hide, perhaps—" "Don't kill anyone," Ansett. "That's not your song. The dance of your hands is ugly without the song of your voice, songbird." The soldiers began to beat on the door, which, because it was steel, did not give way easily. "They'll blow it open in a minute," McCall said. "Promise me you won't kill anyone, no matter who. Please, don't avenge me." "I will." "Don't avenge me. Promise. On your life. On your love for me." Ansett promised. The door blew open. The soldiers killed McCall with a flash of lasers that turned his skin to ashes. They kept firing until nothing but ashes was left. Then they gathered them up. Ansett watched, keeping his promise, but wishing with all his heart that somewhere in his mind there was a wall he could hide behind. Unfortunately, he was too sane. Chapter 22. They took 12-year-old Ansett and the ashes of the Emperor to Susquehanna. The ashes were placed in a huge urn and displayed with state honors. Everyone was told that McCall had died of old age, and no one admitted to suspecting otherwise. They brought Ansett to the funeral feast under heavy guard, for fear of what his hands might do. After the meal, at which everyone pretended to be somber, Richter's called Ansett to him. The guards followed, but Richter's waved them away. The crown rested lightly on his hair. "I know I'm safe from you," Richter said. "You're a lying bastard," Ansett said softly, so that only Richter's could hear. "And if I hadn't given my word to a better man than you, I'd tear you end to end."
If I weren't a lying bastard, Richter's answered with a smile, Mikal would never have given the empire to me. Then Richter stood. My friends, he said, and the dignitaries present gave a cheer. From now on, I am not to be known as Richter's Ashen, but as Richter's Mikal. The name Mikal shall pass to all my successors on the throne, in honor of the man who built this empire and brought peace to all mankind. Richter sat amid the applause and cheers, which sounded like some of the people might have been sincere. It was a nice speech, as impromptu speeches went. Then Richter's asked Ansett to sing. I'd rather die, Ansett said. You will, when the time comes. Now sing, the song Mikal would want sung at his funeral. Ansett sang then, standing on the table so that everyone could see him, just as he had stood to sing to an audience he hated on his last night of captivity in the ship. His song was wordless, for all the words he might have said were treason, and would have stirred the audience to destroy Richter's on the spot. Instead, Ansett sang a melody, flying unaccompanied from mode to mode, each note torn from his throat in pain, each note bringing a sweeter pain to the ears that heard it. The song broke up the banquet as the grief they had all pretended to feel now burned within them. Many went home weeping. All felt the great loss of the man whose ashes dusted the bottom of the urn. Only Richter stayed at the table after Ansett's song was over. Now, Ansett said, they'll never forget Father Mikal. Or Mikal's songbird, Richter said. But I am Mikal now, as much of him as could survive, a name and an empire. There's nothing of Father Mikal in you, Ansett said coldly. Is there not? Richter said softly. Were you fooled by Mikal's public cruelty? No, songbird. And in his voice Ansett heard the hints of pain that lay behind the harsh and unmerciful emperor. Stay and sing for me, songbird, Richter said, pleading around the edges of his voice. I was placed with Mikal, not with you, Ansett said. I must go home now. No, Richter said, and he reached into his clothing and pulled out a letter. Ansett read it. It was in Este's handwriting, and it told him that if he was willing, the songhouse would place him with Richter's. Ansett did not understand, but the message was clear, the language unmistakably Este's own. He had trusted Este when she told him to love Mikal. He would trust her now. Ansett reached out his hand and touched the urn of ashes that rested on the table. I'll never love you, he said, meaning the words to hurt. Nor I you, Richter's answered, but we may, nonetheless, feed each other something that we hunger for. Did Mikal sleep with you? He never wanted to. I never offered. Neither will I, Richter said. I only want to hear your songs. There was no voice in Ansett for the word he decided to say. He could only nod. Richter's had the grace not to smile. He just nodded in return and left the table. Before he reached the doors, Ansett spoke to him. What will you do with this? Richter's looked at the urn where Ansett rested his hand. The relics are yours. Do what you want. Then Richter's Mikal was gone. Ansett took the urn of ashes into the chamber where he and Father Mikal had sung so many songs to each other. Ansett stood for a long time before the fire, humming the memories to himself. He gave all the songs back to Father Mikal, and with love he reached out and emptied the urn on the blazing fire. The ashes put the fire out. Have, Richter's answered. The button on his belt was glowing. Guards came quickly into the room. Take the Chamberlain to a cell, Richter's ordered them. If any harm comes to him, all of you will die, and your families too. Do you understand? The guards understood. They were Richter's men, not the Chamberlain's. There was no love there. Ansett held his arm. Mikal and Richter's Ashen waited while a doctor came and treated it. The pain subsided. The doctor left. Richter's spoke first. Of course, you knew it was
Chapter 20, continued. Exhausted and bleeding, Ansett lay on the floor, his right arm covered with blood. The pain reached him now, and he groaned, though his song was as much a song of triumph as of pain. Somehow it took Richter's a moment to realize what had been said. Only a moment. But before his hand could reach his laser, which was back in his belt, McCall's hand held the laser that was pointed at Richter's heart. "Ansett, my son, will you take the captain's laser from him?" Ansett got up and took the captain's laser from him. He could hear the song of triumph in McCall's voice, but Ansett did not understand. What had Richter's done? This was the man that Este had told him was as much like McCall as any man alive.
"The Chamberlain, my lord."
McCall smiled faintly.
"That was why you let him persuade you to call Ansett back here, to let him show his hand."
McCall's smile grew broader.
"But, my lord, only you could have known that the songbird would be strong enough to resist a compulsion that was 5 months in the making."
McCall laughed, and this time Ansett heard real mirth in the laughter.
"Richter's Ashton," McCall said. "Will they call you Richter's the Great, or Richter's the Usurper?"
How Ansett had had strength enough, had withstood it long enough that he had not killed Father McCall. Finally he rolled over and sat up, nursing his arm. The bleeding had settled to a slow trickle. McCall was still sitting in the chair, which had healed itself. The Chamberlain stood where he had stood 10 seconds before, at the beginning of Ansett's ordeal, the goblet looking ridiculous in his hand. Richter's laser was aimed at the Chamberlain.
"Call the guards, Captain," McCall said. "I already have